So we'll just jump right in. So thank you everybody for joining us virtually at the National Bureau of Asian Research. We have a lot to cover today on South Asia's generational shift and its foreign policy future. So I'll keep my introductory remarks brief. But I want to introduce NBR as an institution. We're an independent research institution based in Seattle and Washington, D.C. in the U.S. And we aim to bring world-class scholarship to bear on the evolving strategic environment in Asia through original policy-relevant research. And over the past 8 months, we've gathered a stellar cohort of emerging and established scholars to look at a set of questions about one, who the emerging leaders are in their countries of focus. And today we'll be focusing on India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And two, how these leaders are likely to steer their country's foreign policies amid tightening US strategic competition. And so the scholars have each authored their own independent analysis and participated in a podcast episode to share their interesting findings. And I want to highlight that this analysis can all be found on our website, nbr.org, after the event. And I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Chris Clary, who has led the South Asia component of this research initiative. He's been offering guidance to our scholars in helping to shape their analysis. Dr. Christopher Clary is an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany, and previously he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International Affairs and International and Public Affairs at Brown University, a pre-doctoral fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, a Stanton Nuclear Security pre-doctoral fellow at RAND, and a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs fellow in India. And he's also served as the country director for South Asian Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So we're really grateful to have had him on board for this initiative and supporting us on this research agenda. I will hand it over now to Chris for your remarks.
Well, thanks, Dante, and thanks, NBR, for hosting. The project comes from the perspective that we're undergoing a period of generational change in South Asia. Most of the countries on the panel have median ages that are below the global average, though Sri Lanka is an older society than some of the others on the panel. We also had or have aging leaders in many of these societies. And so it was appropriate, we thought, to take a moment to look at what the next generation might look like, and if that next generation would have different ideas about politics and foreign policy in particular. And so when NBR approached me to be a consultant for this project, we worked together to find 6 expert analysts based both in the region, but sometimes out of the region. And I'm very pleased with the group we pulled together here. So rather than introduce all 6 of them at the same time, what I'll do is I'll introduce them as we come to their countries. So I want to turn to the region's largest country first, India. And in so doing, I'll introduce the 2 experts that we learned a lot from in this project in thinking about the future of India's foreign policy during this period of generational change. So those people are Dr. Rohan Mukherjee, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. He is a non-resident fellow at NBR, but also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And joining us as well is Bashir Abbas, who's a senior research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research in New Delhi. So let me turn to you both. Rohan, when you looked at what the future will be, how it will be different from today, and you tried to identify who the next generation of political leaders or political stars are in South Asia, who did you identify, and how did you arrive at that conclusion?
Thank you, Chris and NBR, for having me on this project. I looked at 2, I guess you could next generation because they're in their 50s. I think, Prime Minister Modi at the next general election will be 78, so he's on the older side of global distribution, which I think is about 62 is the global median for national leaders. And so, obviously, Prime Minister Modi is on one side, Putin and others. Joe Biden was as well, so is Trump. So in that, by that metric, I would say, leaders who are in their 50s are probably the next generation. And so I looked at one leader who represents a more assertive form of Hindu nationalism than Prime Minister Modi's, which is Yogi Adityanath, current Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh in India. And then one who is perhaps, you could say, to the left, although the left-right spectrum doesn't quite translate in the Indian context in the way it is in the West. But Rahul Gandhi, who's the head of the opposition, sort of on the other side. And so, in a way, one to the right, one to the left of the current prime minister, and them as representatives of broader strands of thinking about India's place in the world. Did you want me to talk more about the findings and so on?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. So, right. So I think basically, my research looked to identify what the foreign policy thinking is of these two groups or types of politicians in the next generation, and think about what happens, what might happen once Prime Minister Modi has retired and left the political stage and so on. And so, I should preface it by saying that I'm not saying either of these individuals might become prime minister. I'm rather treating them as analytically representative of two currents of thought in the Indian leadership. And so the headline really of my finding is that the next generation of Indian leaders may differ sharply in what they think is what the idea of India is, what it should be at home. They don't necessarily differ that much on how India should approach international affairs, and when it comes to US-China competition and India's own exceptionalism and its desire for great power status. And so, in terms of words, they are different. Obviously, I think. Well, I guess the thing that is common between these two types of leaders, Yogi and Gandhi, is essentially the primary thing that they are concerned about is domestic development in terms of the economy, stability, social advancement, and so on. Their visions of the ideal quality are quite different. And so, on the one hand, you have the more hard-edged Hindu nationalism of Adityanath, which treats Indian Muslims and other minorities as internal adversaries. And in that worldview, order and prosperity flows from a coercive state that disciplines minorities of a Hindu nation. Whereas on the Rahul Gandhi side, the BJP itself is the greatest threat to Indian democracy, and for development requires a system in which many voices are represented in a different sort of way. And so, in terms of foreign policy, one can imagine a more Hindu nationalist government would find it harder to sustain the kind of relations that Prime Minister Modi has built with Gulf states, for example, and perhaps even harder with Pakistan and other neighboring countries like Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and the Maldives that are all sort of Islamic majority countries. A more secular government would not necessarily face those compulsions. Then there's differences on national security as well, and similarities. So I think Aditya is fixated on Pakistan, which he's called a failed state or failed nation that will one day merge into India or cease to exist. Rahul Gandhi is firm on Pakistan, but he views China as the larger problem, and has argued that last year's sort of crisis between India and Pakistan in May 2025 exposes what Indian planners had feared for the longest time as a two-front war that was fused into a single front, as it were, with Chinese Pakistan militaries operating in some sort of cohesion. And then the third issue, I think, is Indian exceptionalism. I think Yogi Adityanath locates India's greatness in Hindu civilization, and he invokes the idea of Akhand Bharat, undivided India, and calls on Hindus to shed what he describes as mindset of slavery and colonial inheritances from both British and Mughal rule alike. And for Gandhi, it's much more India's greatness originates in the anti-colonial struggle and in the standing of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, who is Rahul Gandhi's own great-grandfather, and of Mahatma Gandhi himself, who is not related to Rahul Gandhi, but shares the last name. And so Rahul Gandhi calls Indian democracy a global public good and India's greatest strategic asset. But he also concedes the limits of India's willingness to be a quote-unquote good actor when it comes to Pakistan. He says that India cannot have good relations with Pakistan if Pakistan continues to promote terrorism in India. So that's kind of the differences. And I do think, though, I'll just quickly conclude by saying structural constraints do matter in Indian foreign policy. And I think both leaders will, or both types of leaders will still respond to those constraints in the future. India has tried to sort of manage this, walk the line between the US and China, tilting in one direction or the other, depending on how well or badly relations are going with each actor. And I think that we will continue. I think that because India is substantially weaker than both the US and China and depends on both in economic sense, the US being India's chief export market and source of hard power capabilities, and China supplying manufactured goods at a low price that India's largely low-income consumer base can rely on. India therefore has a massive trade deficit with the US and a massive trade surplus with the US and a massive trade deficit with China. So in a sense, it is squeezed in on both sides. And so this constraint will be operative no matter what kind of leader emerges in the future. And there is agreement across the political spectrum on the kind of threat that China poses to India. But the answers to that perhaps are slightly different. There's also greater skepticism around the United States in more recent times because of tariffs that Donald Trump imposed on India, as well as the sort of the credit claiming over who ended the India-Pakistan crisis of last year that took place as well. So in some sense, India will continue to engage China, I think, more actively to diffuse these tensions in the US now, but it will also continue to hedge against China. And so there's this kind of middle path that India seeks to draw. So my conclusion is really undramatic. I guess I'm not suggesting that there will be a break in the way future leaders will approach foreign policy. Things will remain broadly within these structural parameters. What will be different, I think, is the domestic side of Indian society. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So one challenge, many of the authors in this project, of course, the countries themselves have to navigate, is this period of generational shift is occurring at the same time that the global power structure is either undergoing, depending on how you count, a transition from something akin to unipolarity to bipolarity, if it's at two poles with China, or perhaps multipolarity if other poles, the EU, Japan, India, count in the mix as well. But there is this global power shift that's occurring that's conditioning the responses. But these new leaders, this next generation, may have different instincts, different theories about how the world works, even as they're confronting material realities that are kind of ahead of all of us, but they may have different beliefs about the best way to do that. Bashir, how did you approach this set of questions, and areas where you agree with Rohan, or areas where you may have some divergence from the conclusions he arrived at?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to NBR for having me. I think what Dr. Mukherjee just outlined is a great premise for exactly what I found in my paper. And it's a little amusing because I think Rohan and I did not coordinate or even speak to each other at all when we were going about our papers, but we somehow used the sort of same instruments because we were looking at largely the same pieces of evidence. That having been said, I think a crucial preface to my paper was that in the Indian political space, almost all of the real politicking is devoted to electoral concerns, and any expressions and articulations of foreign policy are usually subservient to other issues that determine, the electoral fates of several parties. And currently, it's obviously the third consecutive term of the BJP, but especially with recent events in mind, it isn't really unreasonable to assume that we might see a new prime minister in the future, either in the next election or the one right after. That having been said, I think I completely agree with regard to the three core emerging leaders that Rohan identifies in his paper. But I focus a little more on the opposition, who happens to currently be represented principally by Rahul Gandhi. Now, you have a motley of other opposition leaders, but if you look at the outcome of recent state elections, it's largely become clear that the bargaining power of a lot of other opposition parties has reduced, at least in a relative sense, when you look at the Congress party. So, and naturally, Rahul Gandhi also occupies the position of the leader of the opposition in the lower house of parliament. That being said, uh, what I principally identify is two things. The first is that in terms of nature and objectives, when it comes to India's relationship with the United States and with China, or vis-a-vis US-China competition at large, I feel that there is a large degree of alignment between amongst most political parties in India with regard to what the objective should be. But there is a difference in approach, and that difference has also been reactive. It hasn't come about as from an inherent ideological position. In fact, ideology in some ways has taken a back seat in Indian politics, or at least its manifestation has. But that's a different debate. What I really mean by that is this, that when it comes to the United States and China and US China competition, I sort of identify three pillars. The first is with regard to China, there's broad recognition that China remains a strategic adversary, but that the manner in which India chooses to approach this strategic adversary can include both conciliation as well as confrontation, right? And that's the approach bit. With regard to the United States, there is again alignment in the view that the United States is a strategic partner to India, especially given the large degree of socioeconomic contact between both populations. But that has come with the caveat that India cannot afford to be seen as a junior partner to the United States, right? So, a relationship based on mutual respect. Any approach, either from Washington or New Delhi, under any government, which sort of is viewed as being, deviant from that approach, is obviously met with a lot of criticism from the opposition. The third obviously pertains a little more to the United States because it deals with India's relationship with third states. Again, in recent public discourse, the two states in particular have been Russia and Iran. And the degree to which the Indian relationship with the United States is constrained, very rarely enabled, but mostly constrained by the United States when it comes to India's choices vis-a-vis these other countries. Those are the three main pillars, right? Um, so, as I said, in terms of objectives, opposition parties seem to be aligned. But when it comes to approach, it's become very clear that both on the China and the American front, there have been strong divergences. On the US China front, because the fundamentals see so much alignment in that there is very little natural cohesion between, say, the Indian view of technological advancement and the AI race, especially as there is in China, obviously, which is why there was very little opposition or criticism to how India viewed Pax Silica or India joining it formally, even, right? So when you look at these larger worldviews, you'll see a lot of alignment, especially amongst emerging leaders. But then when you come back to the question of approach, I think the opposition party and especially Rahul Gandhi himself has been consistent in his views, especially since 2020, in June 2020, when the crisis between India and China was sparked off, that the Indian government needs to acknowledge the issues that we have with China. Right. And since late November 2024, we have had a rapprochement with China of sorts. And while the Indian National Congress has not completely or fundamentally opposed that approach, it has sort of continued to articulate its dissatisfaction with how the Indian government has sort of been glossing over key differences at the line of actual control. Differences at the border in both Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, especially. And in fact, I mean, one of those differences is playing out in real time as we sort of conduct this webinar, which is reports of Chinese incursions in a village in Arunachal Pradesh called Taksing. And now this is happening obviously while this period of rapprochement is sort of entrenching itself, right? But currently, both the Indian government and the Indian military is in the process of ascertaining what exactly is happening. But if you look at the larger discourse, especially from the government side, it's pretty clear that it's meant to be de-escalatory. It's meant to sort of not trigger any alarm. The Congress party obviously doesn't buy that, and neither does the leader of opposition. When you look towards the United States, obviously the evidence is far greater because every morning President Trump tweets something, and you first ask whether it's an expression of policy, and if it is, what ramifications will it have? And by the time you find that answer out, the next day there's a new tweet. But there's at least some consistency, especially with regard to Russia and Iran, that the first complaint has been with regard to energy, that look, we understand American concerns, but the view from the opposition camp, especially from the younger side, has been this, that why is it that regardless of whether the government accepts it as so or not, India's ultimate energy choices seem to be in tune with windows that the United States open up or close, right? And this was sort of evident it was almost a microcosm when the US Treasuries recently announced that Iranian oil that's at sea can be purchased and then sort of later close that window, and Indian imports sort of also follow that trajectory. So the Rahul Gandhi has sort of really used pieces of evidence like that to question the government's approach. And then, as Rohan mentioned, when you look at the India-Pakistan crisis, and I think Trump has claimed his ownership of the ceasefire, or rather taken credit over 80 times. And every time it does it, the Congress party reminds the Indian government that we need to counter that narrative. So again, that's a question of approach. And it has that inherent objective of reminding the United States that we're not a junior partner and that there needs to be mutual respect, right? I think I'll just end by saying that the real question for the future is this, that if you have a situation where the differences in approach and the triggers that are being caused, especially from Washington today, will they cause a threshold where, will they cross a threshold where they start affecting those motivations and objectives on which we have seen a lot of alignment across political lines and across demographic lines as well? And all of this is, of course, within that limited set of articulations on foreign policy which we get in the Indian political space. I'll stop there, Chris. I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Yeah, one commonality I have found in international politics is opposition parties love to accuse the ruling party of sacrificing the sovereignty of the nation. It's such a great place for the opposition party to be in. But what in the case of the Indian National Congress, one wonders, of course, whether the leader ascribes to the view sometimes said to previous Congress generations as well that the Chinese killed, Nehru through their perfidy, that their betrayal of him was contributed to his health decline in the early 1960s. So, some themes already that we're going to see, I think, in the later essays are that everyone is trying to accommodate China in different ways. India has by far the most contentious politics with China of the three countries we looked at in this panel. And every country is trying to deal with China at the same time that they are dealing with Trump's tweets. And of course, in the case of some countries, quite a bit more coercion than just some social media jawboning. I will turn next to our two Sri Lanka panelists, though I hope we, in the Q&A, will come back, I'm sure, to Rohan and Bashir. But let's turn now to Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka, I think, shows something that also is present in Bangladesh, which is the power of youth social mobilization to really put pressure on the incumbent parties, right? So Sri Lanka, several years ago, went through a period of considerable political and economic turmoil. Something in the discussion that we had for NPR a few months ago that we discussed is like, should we think of that transformation as revolutionary? I think that label probably applies to Bangladesh, which we'll turn to in just a moment. And so, one question is Sri Lanka the future of some of these South Asian countries? Or, in other ways, it'll be a divergence. So to help us think through what was going on in Sri Lanka, we approached two rising scholars that have already established themselves as clear experts in the field of politics. One is Dr. Bhagya Senaratne, who is an independent scholar, but has been the inaugural research director at the Benderanaike Center for International Studies, has held important research positions at NYU, Shanghai, and in Sri Lanka's own National Defense University as well. And Rajni Gamage, who is a research fellow at the Institute for South Asia Studies at the National University of Singapore. Thank you both for joining us, and especially those of us that are joining us from Singapore, which is very late in the night, so thank you for doing so. Bhagya, let me turn to you first. How do you think about this next generation and the policies they are likely to pursue in Sri Lanka, especially to the extent they diverge from the existing policies?
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to start by picking out something you mentioned about revolution and changes, because the MPP government that came into power, that is in power, is actually that actually rode that wave of struggles, protests, that movement. And at the time I wrote the article, I was reading through it earlier, and I've realized that politics in Sri Lanka have actually changed since. At the time I was writing, I was talking about unpopularity, about possible strikes happening, but I think the government has amped up its efforts and it's doing something different, possibly because upcoming, 2 years and all of that. But going back to the conversation, I want to highlight that in Sri Lanka, I guess even the Indian scholars highlighted this, age is not a really good indicator of us talking about next generation scholars. Because in Sri Lanka, you could talk of next generation scholars as not scholars, next generation leaders as anyone being in their 50s all the way down to the 30s. So those that we are talking about kind of range within that age spectrum. And one couldn't possibly say they are young leaders, but they're definitely those from a different generation, being that they think differently and they behave differently. We also see non-alignment running through some of these engagements in Sri Lanka. But one of the primary considerations for me is that young leaders in Sri Lanka is not a commonality. We don't see a lot of aspiring new young leaders. And this is possibly because in Sri Lanka, we've had a lot of traditional parties, and these political parties have not necessarily groomed their young leaders. And one reason for that has also been because of dynasty politics, where familial connections, father, hands over to the son or some relative, and we see, families like the Senanayakas, Jayawardhanas, Bandanayakas, so on and so forth, kind of ruling or being the political elite in Sri Lanka. And political parties have kind of revolved around these individuals or families. So for a new person to come up, someone who's not part of that system, it's been very difficult for people outside the system to come up. So most often we've seen new or young leaders from these families. And of course, this means you have some of the same thinking within those political parties and families taking place. So in some sense, pedigree really matters in Sri Lankan politics. Having said that, we also see certain disruptors emerging. And this is what we see going forward. We've seen over the years, Sri Lankans have, to a certain extent, gone away from these family politics, started looking at politics differently. And spoken about how things in Sri Lanka, the systems need to change, how we identify leaders need to change. And we see this happening. It's also possibly because we have more access to social media, access to information. And this also means that things like corruption, or if you are doing things to benefit your own family or yourself, it kind of gets out there. And the youth are not tolerant of malpractices now. So we see that in the young generation in terms of those advocating for change. And we see this also reflected in the so-called next generation young leaders that we see. I'll also focus a little bit on Sri Lanka and the US-China competition. So in Sri Lanka, we see Sri Lanka is, I think, to a greater extent benefiting from this competition. And we can also say that Sri Lanka is probably hedging the two countries. Two examples I will give you is in terms of mineral resources. So for example, we see mineral sands such as ilmenite being extracted, and we see an excellent national mineral policy that comes out. And also in terms of like graphite, how US has followed China into Sri Lanka because there is space and China's in this space. So US wants to be in the Sri Lankan space to extract some of the best graphite in the world, the purest graphite in the world. We also see this US-China engagement in Sri Lanka in terms of education, especially in universities. And I think that's also a space where Sri Lanka not just necessarily the leaders, but also, different stratas of society. Especially here, the academics have understood that there is something they could also benefit from this competition. But in essence, I see future leaders also looking at the three prongs, that is India, China, and the US, as the major countries that they will work closely with. And this doesn't steer very far away from what we've seen in our past, in our history. And but again, based on familial ties, based on history, there is potential for these political leaders to again swing towards China, because there are benefits in doing so. But we also see sometimes legacy frameworks or even party ideologies could affect how these new generational individuals could think. So we can't necessarily expect something majorly radical, but I would say there would be limited radical shifts within Sri Lanka. We also see, I guess, in what I was talking about in my article, and also broader research, is that non-alignment would be kind of the basis for Sri Lanka's foreign policy. Now, having said that, we can see that non-alignment is very much in principle, but not necessarily in practice in Sri Lanka. So here, I think we will continue to have that distinction where we talk about non-alignment, but do we necessarily practice it in Sri Lanka? And you can see it through all the parties. Even now, we speak of non-alignment in Sri Lanka, but the NPP government is very aligned with India. And this could possibly be because India is exerting pressure on Sri Lanka, and whether that is also because India wants to ease the Chinese influence from the country. So there are definitely different ways of looking at this, Chris. I'm happy to continue.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, I also noticed recently that the Pew Research Center released some polling that it had done in the spring. In Sri Lanka, the respondents that Pew surveyed at least had the most favorable views of India of any country on the planet, at least as favorable as Indian views on India, I think. So that was notable, and not necessarily the case for Bangladesh, which we'll turn to in just a minute. So thank you so much, Bhagya. Rajni, how did you approach these questions?
Yes, thanks, Chris. So in terms of the identifying which leaders or what the next generation of leaders were for the case of Sri Lanka, I broadly agree with Bhagya in the sense that despite the protests, the people's protests that took place in Sri Lanka in 2022 being largely youth protests, when it came to this question of what the next generation of political leaders were, it was not completely useful to look only at age, because what the 2022 protests also showed was how the existing political parties had been largely delegitimized because of a great deal of public anger and a loss of legitimacy of these groups because of how the 2022 economic crisis unfolded. And so in terms of looking or identifying the next generation of political leaders, like I said, certainly looking at political parties, because this has consistently been the space that has produced political leaders. But then again, as was mentioned, political parties themselves have not been very democratic spaces. And so despite the 2022 Aragalia being a very democratic moment in the sense that a lot of new players and disruptors enter the scene, political parties still act very limited in terms of translating that sentiment into actual political leadership. That being said, the NPP, the National People's Power, which was elected in 2 years after the protests, so in 2024, the NPP does bring in quite a big cohort of individuals and of groups who had been previously excluded from Sri Lanka's political circuits. So certainly talking to that group of people was important. Another group that I looked at, of course, was the activists that were involved in the people's protests, the Aragalia, which had different groups within them, only one of which eventually kind of enters this formation of the NPP, but there were also other groups that did not necessarily form the new government. So activists, academic, civil society, because again, civil society has, in the past, different civil societies have influenced the political or policy-making process. Again, in 2022, we see with the disruptions that there are different versions of civil societies that are emerging. So this was another group that I looked at. Finally, there was also professional associations that we looked at, because political parties have not been as forthcoming in allowing individuals to rise through the ranks and come into political leadership. But one phenomenon that we have seen in Sri Lanka is that professional organizations or professional associations have been a means of lateral entry for aspiring political leaders to kind of rise in their professional careers and then to make a lateral entry into the political party. So even our current Prime Minister, Harini Amarasuriya, was previously an academic and then who enters into party politics laterally. So that was another area at which I looked at. And the final individuals that I looked at were corporates, because we see the increasing influence of corporate actors, of business actors in Sri Lankan politics. And again, I don't think that this is an anomaly in regional politics or even in global politics in Sri Lanka, because the 2022 crisis was very much an economic crisis. Question of how do we kind of recover economically, how do we stabilize economically, that becomes the defining question of our times. And so the entry of business leaders directly into politics, not as an influential actor, but directly into politics, we have seen that happening since the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, but in the current administration as well. So these were basically the sections of society that I looked at in terms of trying to understand if there were shifts among emerging and aspiring political leaders. In terms of what was observed, very quickly, I think we all agree on the fact that the kind of sentiments among these groups towards India seems to be above and beyond positive. And this is, again, really important for the region because, as you mentioned, Sri Lanka seems to be India's closest friend at a time when all of the other regional neighbors are not having very positive sentiments towards India. So this speaks a lot for this bilateral relationship. And I mean, we see this sentiment not only within the ruling party, but also within the opposition, even among the other sections that I talked about. And of course, the main reason for this was that India was the first respondent when it came to the economic crisis, and later the cyclone Ditwa that happened. So whenever there's a big crisis, India does turn up as the first respondent. But also, I think it's the outcome of this long debate or tussle that has been going on in Sri Lankan politics that surfaces usually during elections, but the crisis really brings it to the forefront, which is this debate of democracy versus development, where different governments have at times leaned a bit more towards the Quad component, meaning the West, India, Japan, that component at times. And then there's been another swing back towards the China camp, so as to say. So post 2022, I think there's some agreement that Sri Lanka has firmly entered into India's orbit, and along with India, the US, the West, and Japan. So that we certainly see being entrenched, even with the current NPP government having come into power, despite the current government previously having espoused anti-Indian sentiments and having nominally a Marxist ideology. We see that the entry into India's orbit continues firmly unchecked in this government as well. The second thing that I'd want to say is that when we look at the US-China debate within Sri Lanka, it reflects more as a India-China division. And with regard to India, again, most of these groups recognize that Sri Lanka's economic interests with India are extremely important, but they also recognize that India's security concerns need to be given recognition as well. But that does not necessarily apply when it comes to the Chinese equation. So since the 2022 economic crisis, we see that China takes a bit of a backseat in terms of foreign policy thinking among these groups that we talk to. And there are several reasons for this, including the backlash to China being framed as one of the reasons for the economic crisis. And there's been a lot of debate on this Chinese debt thesis afterwards. But we see that initial step back, and China also kind of reorients its forms of development aid and assistance during this time. And with regard to the US, again, like I said, there is this compartmentalization that we see within the foreign policy discourse, which is that on the economic front, there is this sense of pragmatism or recognition that Sri Lanka has no choice but to work with the US. But when it comes to, because the current context also unfolds as the global rules-based order is dismantling to some extent, there's also this sentiment of mistrust or unpredictability that has been associated with the US when we speak to these leaders. So I think I will stop there. I've spoken quite a lot, and we can take up questions afterwards.
Yeah, these are obviously big topics. And one thing I think that comes out in your essays as well as the Bangladesh essays and even a little bit to the India essays is that for any of these countries that practice it, something like non-alignment, whether they use that phrase or use some other phrase, none of these countries are perfectly non-aligned. The whole goal of non-alignment is to give countries options and latitude to maneuver. So that means over time, the phrase non-alignment allows countries to move more closer and away from different orbits, and part of that is associated with these generational changes. In the Bangladesh case, which we'll turn to now, we've seen maybe the biggest, some of the combination of huge political turnover, but that political turnover, which has a very strong domestic basis, is also closely interlinked with international politics, because the prior government of Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League was so closely tied in people's imaginations and perhaps in material terms with Bangladesh's relations with India. So her ouster, roughly 2 years ago now, is both this big domestic shock, but also has these foreign policy implications that are still kind of we're still seeing as the tectonic plates kind of reshift. So we're happy to have Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, who's an associate with Harvard University's Asia Center, who previously was the country director for Bangladesh for the International Republican Institute, and also has worked with the U.S. Institute of Peace on Bangladesh, help us navigate some of these big shifts. Dr. McDonald, I think in particular, like me, has been closely tied with the policy discussion in the U.S. for many years, so can kind of views Bangladesh with a nice mix of having been a lot of ground experience, but also seeing how it looks like from Washington. And then someone who is really steeped in the current moment in Bangladesh, I'm giving you your doctorate early, Tanvir. Tanvir Habib, who's a lecturer in international relations at the University of Dhaka. Thanks to you both for your essays, which we are in the draft phase. So they're the only essays that are not currently on the website, but they will be soon. So that's another reason our listeners should bookmark the NBR webpage, because they'll be up in a matter of days or weeks at the latest. Let me turn to Jeffrey first. How do you think the next generation of leaders in Bangladesh will approach politics and foreign policy differently than the generation that you and I have observed over the last decade or so?
Well, first, thank you, Chris. Thank you to NBR for having me. I think, similar to what was just discussed on Sri Lanka, when we think about next generation leaders, I think we tend to think of those as young people. But I think in Bangladesh, given the political situation there over the past 15 years under the Awami League, I think it's appropriate to use the term next generation more broadly, right? To include both the student activists that led the July uprising or monsoon uprising, whatever we want to call it, right, against the Hasina government in 2024, and the genuinely new parties that have emerged, but alongside some of the veteran politicians whose path to national leadership was blocked during the Awami League's dominance. So what does this mean for its foreign policy? I think the political transition is going to change the orientation of Bangladesh's foreign policy, but not the fundamental strategy of it. Right? Bangladesh has long pursued a hedging strategy, and by this, it's engaging competing powers simultaneously, extracting economic, security, diplomatic benefits from various international interlocutors, while avoiding a confirmed alignment to any single bloc. Now, under Hasina and the Awami League, this strategy developed, I think, a noticeable tilt toward India. The Awami League prioritized Indian security concerns at the border. It granted India concessions on transit rights, on port access, on energy and resource issues. And Bangladesh government rarely criticized India for some of its domestic and border policies and political rhetoric that were widely considered in Bangladesh as being anti-Muslim or anti-Bengali. India, in turn, provided the Hasina government strong, really unwavering diplomatic backing, despite an increasingly troubling record on human rights and democratic backsliding. And so I think it's important to note the hedging strategy in Bangladesh is not new, but what is new, I think, is that it's becoming less India-centric and more evenly balanced between India, China, US, and other partners amid this kind of post-revolution political elite that has advocated a more kind of equidistant foreign policy. So who are these next generation leaders, right, at the kind of highest level? And perhaps Tanvir will provide more detail on it. I think with the Awami League effectively banned from political competition, you have three political forces that matter most. You have the BNP, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which has been the kind of primary Awami League opponent since the 1990 return to democracy, right, in what is a kind of de facto two-party system. They've emerged as with a supermajority in parliament. You then have Jamaat-e-Islam. Jamaat emerged in the kind of Pakistan era, has been an important but marginal player in politics, right, over the last several decades, banned from political competition under the Awami League, but had kind of a remarkable performance in the February elections and has emerged as the primary opposition in the parliament. And then you have the National Citizen Party, the NCP, which is the political vehicle of the July Revolution, youth-led, which has a few seats in parliament. I think despite real ideological differences between these parties, their foreign policy instincts, I think, overlap substantially. They're all deeply critical of India's political influence in Bangladesh. They're skeptical of India's intent toward Bangladesh in bilateral relations, but still recognize a need for engagement. They favor autonomy of action in foreign policy, and they want good and positive relations with the United States and China. And so these positions, I think, align toward a recalibration of Bangladesh's foreign policy toward greater balance. So I think what is interesting isn't where these parties disagree, and they do disagree, it's how much they agree, right? And so that leads to the question of what is pushing them in this direction to agree. Now, there's a variety of factors we can discuss. I'll highlight two. One is the domestic politics of Bangladesh, which has made this old tilt toward India increasingly costly. There's a bunch of surveys. You referenced the Pew survey. There was a survey in 2025 that had 60% of Bangladeshis saying India had a negative impact on their country. It was the highest level of negativity of any of the countries surveyed. What's driving this are some longstanding grievances, border killings, which continue, water sharing issues, perceptions of Indian interference in Bangladesh politics. But India's decision to take in Hasina after the overthrow, in its ongoing decision, which came to the fore kind of over the last few weeks as well, to let Hasina effectively run political activities from Delhi, have reinforced and really inflamed these anti-India sentiments. And for this new political class, this idea of greater distance from India isn't simply a foreign policy. There's a clear domestic political constituency for this as well that's pushing in this direction. The other factor that I'll highlight is the economic realities of Bangladesh, which require pragmatism. Bangladesh really can't afford exclusive alignment. It relies heavily on Western markets for garment exports. It also relies on Chinese investment in infrastructure. It's and defense cooperation for China. And it also has a series of economic vulnerabilities on currency shortages, debt, inflation, and other issues that make a diversification of this hedging strategy quite important. So I'd say the kind of bottom line in this kind of thinking about the next generation in foreign policy is that this political revolution in Bangladesh is unlikely to produce a revolution in foreign policy, but I do think it is producing a recalibration, right? So I expect Bangladesh, and I think we're seeing this, will continue to hedge in terms of kind of diversifying its relationships but this hedging will be less India-centric and more balanced. I'd highlight, just to conclude, a couple of key factors that I think are going to shape this rebalancing moving forward. One is if the Awami League eventually returns to political competition, and almost certainly will at some point, then you have a pro-India voice kind of returning into the debate. If Jamaat's support recedes, which it could, you then have a kind of anti-India voice weakening, right, which will shape a bit of the foreign policy discussion. And then you have the question of what will India do, right? India has agency here in how Bangladesh is reacting to it, right? If India tries to build a relationship with Bangladesh's new political class, then perhaps this rebalancing will not tilt as far away from India as one might expect. It's not really what we're seeing currently. We're seeing a lot of hostility, right? And so this alternative of if India-Bangladesh relations become increasingly antagonistic, then you could see a more lasting negative tilt away from India in contrast toward a more kind of balanced hedging, right? So you can have balanced hedging, but you could also have a tilt, just like a permanent tilt away from India, which could develop. So I think the final balancing of Bangladesh's foreign policy is still in flux, but it will be shaped both by, I think, domestic politics on one hand, and some of the diplomatic and undiplomatic engagements between Delhi and Dhaka on the other. And we're seeing that play out kind of in real time right now. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, of all of the countries, we've discussed, the Bangladesh has these competing tendencies playing out in almost real time as the new BNP government wants to think about how it should reach out to Delhi amid Sheikh Hasina's presence there. I will turn to Tanvir in just a second for his kind of view of the situation as it's unfolding. But I also want to tell the audience that after our Tanvir's insights, we'll open it up to questions. I have a lot of questions. I try to be an inquisitive person in my life, but I also want to make sure you have an opportunity. So if you in the audience have a question either directed at a speaker or more broadly, you can type those directly into the chat function. They'll go to the NBR staff and they'll pass them along to me. But Tanvir, let's turn to you now. Where's Bangladesh going? What did your research find?
Right. Thank you, Professor, for allowing me to speak, and thank you, Dr. Jeffrey, for his wonderful introduction. I think Bangladesh has undergone a fundamental recalibration of its foreign policy discourse, especially after 2024. Previously, terms like political alignments and geostrategic alignments with other countries were seen more in terms of political affinity to particular actors, and this has now shifted decisively towards strategic necessity that is driving these engagements. So previously, regime-centric approach to foreign policy is now shifted towards a more state-centric one. So that is one of the key drivers that we see right now, and that's where we see a lot of convergence among political parties, where a lot of the discussions that we're having right now, the similarities that we're having right now, is because of those core alignments that we're seeing across political parties. So that's number one. Secondly, I think all the political parties are undergoing a fundamental transformation in their foreign policy wing. So BNP is one of the old guards of Bangladeshi policy, but some of the old managers or the old guards of BNP's foreign policy are either dead or they are octogenarians, unable to contribute properly to foreign policy wing of the party. So BNP's foreign policy wing is still very young. So let me just take a little bit of an inspiration from Dr. Jeffrey and say that young should be considered as a state of mind in Bangladesh rather than a particular age. So BNP and other parties have not been in power for like 17 years. So people who are like in their 40s right now were dealing with foreign policy wing, right? So they would have been very young had BNP been in power previously, right? So that's why we see that all the political parties, all the actors in the foreign policy wing are quite young in themselves. And one of the key interesting facts is that the shift of regime-centric policy to a state-centric one is evident across all political parties. So the fact that Bangladesh wants to hedge, it is more in terms of a contextual engagement with all the parties. So US, China, India, any other country that you talk about, across political parties, you would find that everyone is talking about contextual engagement, where Bangladesh benefits and where Bangladesh's interests are concerned, everyone is aligned in that particular segment. Yes, there are several divergences. For example, Jamaat wants a foreign policy with a bit of ideological tilt and a civilization identity, which is a very interesting wordplay at the concept of Islamic Ummah or the Muslim Ummah that we are all familiar with. Right? So that's a very interesting innovation from the Jamaat. At the same time, with regards to NCP, one of the key divergences that we see was the incorporation of the diaspora community in the foreign policy decision-making processes, and they were very vocal. And we must not forget the fact that during the violent uprising that happened to oust Sheikh Hasina from power, diaspora community across Western and other countries, even in Middle East as well, were very active in ensuring that there was an international support for Bangladesh, what was happening inside Bangladesh. And NCP, being the party that has come out of this student-led movement, has been one of the key drivers in that regard. So that is some of the divergences and similarities as well. To be more precise in terms of the foreign policy outlook, with regards to India, I think they are the actor that is going to lose out and that has lost us most in terms of the agreements that has happened. And India was seen to be too much close to Sheikh Hasina. And as such, across political spectrum, there has been an understanding that this kind of subservience relationship, quote and unquote, is not something that we are going to repeat no matter what happens in the coming days. And even if Awami League returns to power in 10 or 15 years' time, given the shift that has happened across Bangladeshi political discourse, especially regarding foreign policy, it is unlikely that even Awami League returning to power will be able to pursue a kind of India positive foreign policy that they have been doing till now. So that is one of the key issues. Second is across political party that we see is a more better relations in terms of regional cooperative organizations. So interesting fact came from the Jamaat, especially. They wanted to turn Bangladesh into a logistical hub like Singapore. And it was quite interesting for us to hear, because later on we saw when the Prime Minister visited China, there was a proposal for a regional connectivity from Yunnan to Chittagong through Burma, right? So this is an interesting aspect where most of the political parties see similarities. And NCP's foreign policy wing is being held by Alauddin Muhammad, who is an economics graduate. So naturally, he has a lot of interest in terms of economic cooperation and this kind of regional connectivity projects as well. In terms of what BNP is doing right now in power, so coming back to the Grand Old Party, BNP, I think, has identified that in terms of climate diplomacy, Bangladesh has an edge over a lot of the global South countries and global North countries, and that's what they have taken this as a key agenda in terms of the foreign policy objectives. So one of the reasons why our paper did not come is because we could not get interviews with anyone from BNP. I was very lucky that I managed to get an interview just today, a few hours back, with Dr. Simon Parvez. He is a special assistant to Prime Minister on climate change and others, and he was also a member of the BNP's foreign policy wing. So this young generation who were dealing with foreign policy while in exile abroad in various Western countries, now they have come back and they have taken over some of the major responsibilities of foreign policy engagement. So he did mention to me today in his interview that climate change is going to be, or climate diplomacy is going to be a key dynamics where BNP is going to work. And this has a historic precedence, to be honest, because during the time when President Ziaur Rahman is in power and BNP was founded, at that time Bangladesh was very vocal among global South countries and among developed countries in many international forums, and also among the Muslim countries as well. So we know that Bangladesh was one of the founding members of Al-Quds movement. So this allowed us to have a lot of say in terms of getting support from the Muslim countries as well. While BNP's engagement with Muslim countries have been based on economic pragmatism, for Jamaat, it is more in terms of an ideological turning their foreign policy. So that is where we see some of the key trends developing. For NCP, I think a lot of their ideas are coming from a lot of places. So I don't think there is a coherent philosophy behind their foreign policy, unlike BNP or unlike Jamaat. But we should not be discounting NCP because they are still in the foundational ages and their institutional capacity is still developing, but they do have some right ideas in place. So I think with questions, I think I can be a bit more specific in terms of where people. So.
Well, thank you to all 6 essayists. I think a number of themes have come across already, but one interesting one is non-alignment for Sri Lanka has meant that it has kind of moved a little bit away from the Chinese orbit back closer to the Indian one, and then non-alignment for Bangladesh has meant the opposite, that it has tried to move a little bit away from India and toward China. Though with the Sri Lanka's geography surrounded by water affords it a little bit more freedom of movement here. Bangladesh is surrounded on all sides by India, except for a tiny border with Myanmar, which is not going to help very much in terms of geopolitical attitude. So that, that is one, these changing structural realities also then interact with, I think, something that Rohan in particular, but both Bashir and Rohan mentioned, which is at some level, the next generation of political leadership in India is kind of contributing to some of these shifts we're seeing with the next generation of political leadership in Bangladesh, especially, right? So as the BJP has made inroads into West Bengal, the rhetoric they use has not helped dampen anti-India sentiment in Bangladesh. And there is a way that the political tendencies in both Bangladesh and India are kind of feeding off of each other in like kind of, I don't know, two wildfires near each other or something to that effect. It's not entirely salutary to any of the parties that are involved. I wanted to go back, actually. There's one thing that came out since, the India essays were written the earliest in this project. And one thing that has emerged since then is this Cockroach Janta Party. And it is interesting both in terms of Indian domestic political politics, but it is also emblematic of the same sort of social mobilization pressures that we witnessed in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. One thing that distinguishes these three countries is if you were to pick, randomly sample an unemployed person in any of the three countries, the odds that that unemployed person is young is very high. I spent this morning trying to disentangle ILO versus World Bank versus national estimates of these things, and the figures vary. But in all three countries, if you are young, the odds of you, if you are unemployed, the odds of you being young are something between like 2/3 or 80%. That is not the case in the developed West. The percentage of youth unemployment is dramatically different. And that obviously feeds into this discontent. And in the Indian case in particular, it seems like youth unemployment among the college educated is also high. And so there you have this big, going back for social theory, at least back to Schumpeter, if not earlier, when you have educated people that are unemployed, they get real upset. And they have a lot of human capital that they can use to organize. So I wanted to know if I could put Bashir on the spot here and ask him how he thinks about the Cockroach Janta Party, and maybe in comparison to some of the social mobilization that India has seen next door in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka and Nepal. It seems much smaller at some level, but it also seems important. So Bashir, how do you think about it?
Thanks, Chris. I should start by saying that never in my wildest dreams had I thought that what started as a meme on Twitter and almost off the cuff would now be a subject of serious discussion here. But I was there at Jantar Mantar. I was there at the protests across the period, including its culmination. And I got to speak to a lot of people myself, in fact. So it was a very revealing experience for everybody, again, across age groups, because even though CJP started out being led by very young people, especially professionals, or lawyers, technical folks, engineers as well, but eventually drew a very broad demographic, right? In terms of its evolution, I think what has been most interesting is a contrast with a moment that India has experienced in the past. In fact, a moment that contributed to the rise of the current leadership in India, which is the India Against Corruption movement, which ran for quite some time, but especially between 2011 to 2013. This is not really tangential, but in fact directly related to this point, so just bear with me. But the narrative around what IAC did has sort of changed in our discourse, where presently it's viewed a little differently, where earlier it was seen as this sort of very, very sacred movement against corruption, especially in the state's institutions, is now sort of being subject to a very revisionist view. And I don't use that word pejoratively at all, where it sort of detracted from other legitimate political opposition groups and was seen as a more of of a sponsored organized movement. When CJP began, I know that there was this degree of suspicion which a lot of people very reasonably had. And these are not people who you would assume to naturally be supporters of the current ruling establishment in New Delhi. So you had people sort of seeing these two kinds of beliefs coexist, where on one hand, there was a lot of disenchantment with the government and a lack of accountability, as well as a lot of suspicion towards what this new movement was aimed at, right? Just one minor point here is that the CJP moment itself was triggered by the leak of an exam which forms the doorway to one among two most popular professions in India, or at least socially accepted, which is either medicine or engineering, right? Now, the NEET exam is for the former. So once you had the paper leak itself, that was obviously tragic and disastrous. But in addition to that, you also had this blatant lack of accountability, or even a degree of indifference towards this event, right? But ultimately, if you compare what the protest at Jantar Mantar here in New Delhi was looking to achieve, or the door that it arrived at, you would see that that door is something that protesters of all kinds have already arrived at, which is that of accountability. Right. So eventually the motivations did not so much matter, which is why I think it blossomed into something larger. But while it did that, and while it achieved a victory insofar as the specific resignation of a cabinet minister is concerned. Resignations have happened in the past, but none which have been so directly caused by a large scale protest movement, right? But what CJP has not done is to sort of portray itself as a political force which is going to jump into the electoral fray. And so far, I feel that has helped its sustenance. It has drawn support from a motley of political groups, including the principal opposition party, but a lot of these parties have not sort of joined the movement in the sense that they to give the CJP a very political character in terms of its objectives. It is political in its cause, it is political in the instruments that it uses. But if you ask any CJP leader, especially one of whom I know very well, they will tell you that the objective remains to be a pressure group, right? I think at this point, and trust me, this is still a very, very volatile point in just this year of Indian politics. This might change in the future, but I suspect it won't. And that is a principal difference between what happened in Nepal, what happened in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka as well to a certain extent, and what is happening in India, where there is this recognition that, look, India's election machinery is entrenched. And we know that it has been tarnished to a large extent across the last 2 years, given the current chief election commissioner who was praised by the US president, again, something I woke up to this morning. But again, the principal opposition party has now been saying that, well, you cannot trust the election machinery itself. But nonetheless, there is this idea that given the first past the post system, given the degree to which you've had third or fourth fronts that have always detracted from what a legitimate opposition party could achieve, especially when there is high anti-incumbency, you wouldn't want a distraction. Now, I know that word is too reductionist, but nonetheless. So that is where CJP's similarities with a lot of the other movements, especially in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, and in Nepal, it stops, right? Where the CJP still aims to remove the political dispensation in power, or certainly looks to garner more accountability. But the CJP, at least thus far, has not sort of shown characteristics that the NCP very quickly did. I mean, the NCP itself came about due to the political ambitions of Nahid Islam and several other student leaders. I don't wish to get into their electoral evolution, but this is something that we witnessed in Nepal as well. And I suspect CJP itself is learning from that. Again, this might change in the future, because what seems to be desirable for a large section of the Indian population, especially the young unemployed Indian population, the CJP tomorrow might come about and say that we might be the most sincere, diligent, and authentic instrument for this demographic to really channel their electoral rights through. But that has not happened yet, which is why my characterization of the similarity and the difference. If that changes, then obviously this conversation also changes. I hope that answers your question, Chris.
No, that's great. Let me reframe the question a little bit for Rohan just to bring him in, which is either the CJP or anything else. When you think back about the essay you submitted roughly 6 months ago, is there anything in terms of current events that you had thought has been especially noteworthy, either in terms of maybe shifting your analysis, like a good Bayesian, or maybe reaffirming it, and it's something that you think you were like, oh yeah, my analysis was right on. How do you think about the political developments since your essay was posted on the NBR website?
I guess more to the reconfirming, maybe this is just telling of my age as a researcher, which I tend to see more status quo than change in most things that I look at, and perhaps my social scientific sort of whatever tendency to think of things in structure rather than agency. I'm old enough to remember attending protests in 2012 against the previous regime, as it were, against the Congress government, when there was a widely publicized case of gang rape in Delhi in 2012. And Alice attended those protests, and there was this great sense of optimism as if something was going to happen. And of course, nothing happened, right? And I think to some extent, again, the classic figures of the opposition, I think you alluded to this earlier, Chris, and I think it bears, and it sort of, one should keep it in mind in a sense, with regard to methodology as well, which is when we interpret things that opposition leaders say, it's often fairly costless to say things in the opposition. The constraints of governance and politics apply differently when you're in power, right? And I think the Congress government back then treated protest very similarly to the way the BJP government did today, right? They invoked colonial era laws and sort of provisions that allowed the police to seal off and cordon off parts of the city, allowed a heavy-handed approach. We were tear gas, we were, all this stuff. I guess we're all going to come out with our protest stories today. But anyway, the point being, I think that in a sense, the Indian state has always been coercive. And I think the changes that we are seeing in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe, or years, are more a question of degree than type. I think that the current regime has gotten very good at using those tools of coercion, and capacity has sort of just by itself increased over time. And you see this in how India has sort of defeated insurgencies in different parts of the country. I think there's, in general, the upper hand is now with the state security forces. The state is also very good at sort of repressing various movements. What I will say, though, is I think if one is worried about the health of Indian institutions like the Supreme Court Election Commission and others, which one should be, then protest shows us in some sense that there is a fire break in Indian democracy where the government is responsive when people show up in the streets, particularly a government of this nature which is always in campaign mode and is seeking to sort of win elections every around the country. We saw this with the farmer protests that happened a few years ago. We've seen this with the students as well. There is this kind of limiting factor where once people in the streets, the BJP government is more willing to sort of compromise, right, with protest. Now, at the same time, the longer term trend here is also one of what you might call digital authoritarianism, which is now we're seeing facial recognition technologies and other types of technology, social tracking and so on, being used to track the individuals who are in protests. And what that means then for the future of democracy, in not India, but in South Asia, in other places around the world, even in the UK for that matter, it gets harder and harder for individuals to overcome the personal conflict calculation that goes into showing up at a protest, right? If you know that there are going to be long-term consequences on your education, on your employment, on your standing in society. And so these are things that we're all very used to talking about in the context of China, but frankly, this is now a problem of modern democracies as well, in the US too. And so there are all of these things that now sort of one thinks about whether this actually impacts foreign affairs, perhaps. I mean, I think there may be a question about the concerns about these image on the global stage of sort of police beating up young students. I think that may have had a role to play. But again, I see that as more of a limiting factor against the backdrop of a broadly coercive Indian state that has been that way since 1947.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that it is often the case that the youth have grievances and the youth power social mobilization movements, and then the societies can only respond to some small portion of them. There's a line in the sequels to the Star Wars franchise that somehow Palpatine returned, somehow the hegemonic structures that we were rebelling against returned, and that is a tendency in all the societies that we are a part of. I want to bring in, and you should feel free, Jeffrey, as well, but I want to bring in especially Bhagya, Rajni, and Tanvir. What does it mean in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh for you to have these youth-powered movements that achieve at some level some major political change, but then it never is as much change as they had hoped, right? And in some cases, Bangladesh is noteworthy. The actual youth leaders don't even achieve that much political power at the end of the process, right? They get kind of co-opted by an old, kind of dueling hegemonic party in the system. So, Bhagya, I thought I'd turn to you, but how does it mean if you're a 20-year-old, you put yourself in the street, you got hit by tear gas, and you were rewarded by a 50-year-old leader as kind of like as your benefit for that process? How do you think about whether these people will become the rising leaders in the future, or and also about what does it mean to have these kind of grievances out there? And then Rajni and Tanvir, feel free to jump in.
So for me, I think in Sri Lanka with the Aragalaya or the struggle, I think we saw a lot of Gen Zs, but also, I mean, we saw a wide range of people participating. I think one of the biggest concerns people had was they were very energized, they were very vocal, but how could you sustain that interest? How could you sustain that momentum through a long period? And I think over the months we saw sometimes there was some disenchantment, whether this would actually happen. But also for me, personally, I feel in terms of the Gen Zs, the youth population, they're very motivated at the forefront, from the get-go, but after a while they cannot sustain themselves. They cannot maintain that same interest in a political movement. So I don't know, compared to say an older generation, perhaps our generation, I see something slightly different to the Gen Zs or the very young people in their early 20s, especially in Sri Lanka. I can't speak for Bangladesh. So for me, Sri Lankan politics will be very different going forward, is what I feel, because our interests are changing. The people, especially youth aren't very interested in politics in some stratas. So I think there's something for us to think about in Sri Lanka, because for the larger part in Sri Lanka, we've been governed by slightly older men, right? And it's only very recently with Anura that we see somewhat of a younger male ruling the country, and we've only had that one female president. So there's a lot for, I think, Sri Lankans to unpack, especially the young generations to unpack. What kind of leaders are we looking at? Which genders are we looking at? And currently, I think Prime Minister Amarasuriya has a better image as opposed to perhaps President Disanaika. So there are these dynamics, I think, people are looking at, observing, and appreciating, taking into consideration. But I think going forward, there'll be a lot to unpack for Sri Lankans, because I think they're not too happy about how things are panning out. As I mentioned before, the government is really trying catch up, playing catch up with everything they're doing right now. And everything I'm seeing on social media, I can see that people are also closely watching. Young people are closely watching what the government is doing. So it's only a matter of time, Chris. And I've seen a large shift in how things are panning out from when the essay was written to what's happening now in Sri Lanka.
Okay, yeah, Rajni, how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with parts of what Bhagya is saying, and in terms of how satisfied are the protesters that kind of filled our streets in 2022 with the results that are happening now. And I think this has largely to do with the articulation of the problem in 2022 by this majority of the protest groups. Because in 2022, the crisis gets really articulated as this issue of predominantly corruption, and the solution then gets framed as anti-corruption and a kind of a revamping of the political system. So the system change, the slogan of system change that we heard within the protests. But here again, this issue of the economics and the politics being artificially demarcated comes back into the problem, because the problem gets articulated largely as this rot within the political system. But really in 2022, what does not get articulated is that, as you mentioned, this issue of underemployment of educated young people not really finding employment opportunities that are commensurate with those educational achievements, this social mobility dream that they had been told by their parents' generation is not really been realized. So within the protests, we don't really hear the articulation of how the economic systems have failed us, and how Sri Lanka's economic development, the kind of structural transformation that we should have seen, that was promised by the kind of development dream of the West, it didn't really get materialized in Sri Lanka. But we didn't hear that being articulated in 2022. Instead, what we heard in 2022 was this liberal consensus across all the political groups. In fact, I mean, laughably, we saw protests saying the IMF should come to Sri Lanka. I mean, this is very different to the kind of politics that we had seen in Sri Lanka in the 1980s. So you have a complete kind of rewriting of the narrative, the mainstream public discourse within the protests. And we see the results of that right now, because, like I said, Sri Lanka's entry into India's orbit in 2022 happens as India says that, look, we will give you aid on the conditionality that you enter into this IMF program. So the entry or the lack of alternatives to the IMF gets really articulated as a solution to the 2022 crisis. And as we know, the IMF program is heavily a revenue-heavy kind of fiscal stabilization program that does not address the structural ills of Sri Lanka's economic or development trajectory. So if you're talking about the lack of industrialization or the lack of manufacturing, these problems are not addressed by the kind of current economic reforms that the state is going through. And so Sri Lanka's economic trajectory is very much still tied to remittances and tourism, and of the state managing to make do with whatever revenue that it has. And so I would really characterize it as this lack of structural transformation that does not happen after 2022, and the government's kind of promise of anti-corruption, but the economic dividends of anti-corruption are very low and very little. And so we see that the NPP government is actually still quite popular because of these kind of anti-corruption protests that it's pursuing, because of certain public measures such as importing a lot of public transport buses. So there are these surface level addressing of issues, but I think in the absence of the structural transformation, it's only a matter of time before the people once again realize that these consumption-heavy, infrastructure-heavy development dream that they had been asking for several governments, successive governments, that this won't be realized under this government as well.
Tanvir, how do you think about this mismatch between the aspiration of recent protesters and the realities that they are living in, and what that means for politics in Bangladesh?
Right. I think with regards to Bangladesh, when some of the student advisors, when student coordinators become advisors to the interim government under Dr. Mohammad Yunus, they quickly understood that they were woefully underprepared to deal with an entrenched bureaucracy or the business interest. So initially there was a sense that they're going to create a new republic, usher in a new political system, and completely transform the state as it is. But as it becomes quite clear that they were not the only actors in the political dynamics fighting against Sheikh Hasina, there are entrenched parties like BNP and Jamaat who have been fighting for political accountability and democratic transition for 16 or 17 years. So NCP had to water down some of its demands in the initial phases. And there was an understanding in the party as well. Before the party formed, they did approach a lot of expert and quite experienced people in terms of helping their party, because they were quite good at street politics. But with regards to democratic and electoral politics, they needed their party structure. They needed a lot of policy discussions to be had, which they were not prepared for, right? So most of them were like university graduates or like postgraduates who have recently graduated from university. So It was in the initial days, yes, that NCP felt that they could do a lot of things, but once some of the people went into government under Yunus, they realized how woefully they were underprepared. So reality check was quite fast, and then NCP gradually started to reorient itself. And when the party was officially formed, I think they have shifted a lot from this revolutionary style politics to more of being a political party in evolution. So that is something that they have been going through. Are they unhappy about the trajectory of how politics have been? Absolutely, yes. But has it been absolutely so contentious that they could not engage with other political parties? No, because when recently we saw there was an energy crisis in Bangladesh, and there was a lot of question about how BNP mismanaged it, the Prime Minister formed a special team of all the political parties. Jamaat, NCP, everyone was there. They had suggestions, and government was able to bring the situation under control. So they are being, how do I put it, accommodated inside the political system that is there. And the way the politics used to be in Bangladesh during Sheikh Hasina's period, that opposition activists and leaders would be abducted or enforced quite normally, quite regularly. That is not the case so far in Bangladesh. And there is a tendency in government that they are engaging a lot of the political parties. Yes, NCP might be electorally weak. Their party structure may not be as strong to challenge BNP or Jamaat in the electoral field in any near future. However, they do provide a very solid opposition, at least activism against any party that is there. For example, at the university level, NCP's student wing is very vocal against Jamaat's student wing, despite the fact that they're aligned at the national political level, right? At the same time, sometimes we see cooperation between BNP student wing and NCP student wing against Jamaat. So there is a flexible approach in terms of politics regarding that. So it is not as contentious as it used to be. But is Bangladeshi politics going to be a bit contentious in the coming days? Absolutely yes, because Bangladesh, unlike a lot of other South Asian countries, do not necessarily have the degrees of ethnic or religious fault lines that are there. However, politics is the only ground that people can engage into a little bit of conflict in relations. So I think that is something that is going to be present in Bangladesh for the foreseeable future. But did NCP get a bit of reality check in terms of their aspirations and the realities of running a state? Yes, and I think that has watered a lot of their rhetorics down in recent past, where they are unhappy about a lot of things. That is political rhetoric, but are they going to challenge the entire system into something that cannot be accommodated? No, I don't think that is going to happen in the coming days.
Well, thank you, Tanvir. Let me ask our last question to Jeffrey, and I'm mindful that we are approaching the time because I don't want to abuse either the panelist labor anymore or the audience's attention. But Jeffrey, when you advantage, you have many advantages. One advantage you have is you've watched many of these developments from DC. When you think about Bangladesh, the case that we asked you to write on, or maybe some of the other cases we've discussed today, how well do you think Washington is monitoring these changes? And it's possible that these changes are very interesting and worthy of study, but may not be that important for U.S. policy. How important do you think some of these changes are for U.S. policy?
I think they are important for U.S. policy, though I don't know how closely they're being monitored, to be perfectly honest. I mean, when we think about particularly the Bangladesh case, right, you had during the Biden administration several kind of pillars of the approach to Bangladesh. I mean, you had development assistance, but you also had a look at the Rohingya issue, you had labor issues, you had democracy, you had business, you had China competition, right? And particularly during the Biden administration, you had a real focus on democracy and governance, right? And that became, I think, the central pillar of the American view on Bangladesh. And then you had this kind of remarkable political transformation in Bangladesh, and that focus on democracy and governance has largely evaporated. And now the American approach in Dhaka is almost exclusively on commercial diplomacy, which is the focus of the U.S. administration really across the board, across South Asia and in many countries around the world. And I think when you see that kind of that focus, you're then losing some of those other pieces that I think would be important to stabilizing Bangladesh. And I think Bangladesh is an important player in South Asia. They're an important player in the region. Its political and social stability are important. And when we're just focusing on commercial diplomacy, right, at the expense of democracy, human rights, right, and other kind of development issues, right? You might get a good deal on trade, but if Bangladesh becomes unstable politically and socially, it has reverberations across the region and reverberations that could harm American interests. I'd imagine the government in Dhaka is quite happy to have the U.S. not focusing on democracy issues. It was a huge bone of contention with the Awami League government, and so I don't think any government in Dhaka loves the attention of the U.S. on democracy issues. But nevertheless, I think the lack of focus on some of those things, right, could prove, I think, detrimental to U.S. interests over the long term.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn things back over to Dante here in just a second, but I really appreciate all of the work that the panelists have done, both on the essays, but also with your time on podcasts, as well as this presentation. And, this is a region with, depending on how we count, 1.6, 1.8 billion people. We're just scratching the surface. So I hope people also read your broader writings on these topics, reach out to you, because I agree with Jeffrey that it's hard for U.S. policy to be optimally placed here without some understanding of these dynamics. So Dante, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you for leading such a great discussion. And thank you to all of our scholars who have been so gracious in sharing their really valuable research insights, and for many of you who stayed up late with us to discuss this. If you found this conversation helpful, I just want to remind everybody that their essays and podcast discussions are up on the NBR website at nbr.org. So please have a listen, take a read, really great. So thank you so much for tuning in. I think we can wrap up here. Thanks so much.
All the best.